I reached 400 subscribers, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do for the video that uses the number 400. And what I came up with is a map that you see on screen here. This is a world map that I created very, very quickly, about an hour or so ago. It didn't take me very long, maybe 30 minutes in total. And the interesting thing about it, and where the 400 comes in, is this world map is only 400 miles across, east to west. You see that there is the scale right over here across the top, and it's only 400 miles. I broke it down a little further to show you some 25-mile blocks. And then what you also have is you have this box here, which is a 25-mile box. And what that did is that allowed me to have sort of a reference point when I was creating some interesting locations. I think the point of today's video is, at its core, is basically more of a free think, just a creative exercise. But what I want to highlight and illustrate is how you can create things a lot smaller. And whether you're a new DM and you're venturing forth into creating your own world, you're doing some world building stuff, but just, I think, more of a creative approach. You know, in a lot of my videos, I always talk about shrink your dreams or boil things down to one session, kind of shrink it down a little bit, because I feel like oftentimes we can be, as creative individuals, we can have such grandiose ideas, and we can kind of dabble into and delve into these books that are 300-400 pages long, and you've got all these world maps. Like, let's say, you know, to give some perspective, Forgotten Realms is something like 4,000 miles across. Eberron is over 3,000 miles across. And barring some interesting travel, such as, teleportation from a wizard, or, dragons, or obviously I know Eberron has like the light rails. So I think there's a certain sense of travel is a big aspect of Eberron. Therefore, it's okay to have such a large place. But at the very, very lowest level, when you're dealing with just basic foot travel, right? 25 miles a day of travel, a 3,000-mile location can be really kind of overwhelming. It can almost feel like you're going to isolate your gameplay down to one area for a little while, and you're going to leave that stuff that's 2,500 miles in the east, you're going to leave that alone for a little while. But I think more importantly, if you were creating your own content, if you start thinking too big, it becomes difficult to kind of lose sense of the detail and the interesting bits within. So I think in today's sort of creative exercise, what I want to show here and highlight is, again, I want to latch onto and lean into the whole 400 thing, because that's how many subscribers I hit as of yesterday today. So in honor of that, I created this 400-mile map, and I want to show you how you can create something that's 1/6, 1/7 the size of an Eberron or a Wildmount, and still have so much interest. Because what you can then do is, by showing these little places and how things are so closely attached and how there's so much value in gameplay within, if we look at a box right here, based on my scale, the box where I've created these interesting locations, remember, this is a 25-mile box. I've created essentially 125 miles, a ton of interest within this 125-mile range. But what I can do later at another time is, if I can focus on this 125-mile box first, I can create another 125-mile box. And I can just keep duplicating this over and over and over and over again. And the result is you end up with 3,000 miles of really interesting gameplay. Instead of having the idea that I want to create a 3,000 mile across map, something that goes from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States, and filling it in, or not filling it in, I should say, with all of this empty space of 900 miles of wasteland, what happens when your players travel across that? Do they instantaneously travel across that by saying that they teleport 900 miles to the east to go to this key city or this key location? Do you just have a couple of random encounters and then say nothing else exciting happened over the 11 days? Do you create content and make that 1,000 miles of travel across the east and make that as your actual gameplay? Or are you one that kind of that intends to sort of just create the interesting points from where you start and where you end up, and all the other stuff in the middle is glossed over? But when you shrink things down into this 400-mile size, you'll notice, if this is our little box template here, from the Dungeon of Deadhome to Goblin Warrens, that's about a day of travel. From the Goblin Warrens to Bine Rock, that's a day of travel. From Bine Rock to Araskale, that's a day. Another day. Another day. A day to the Kraken Waste. About another 25 miles to Visk. 25 miles to Gromadia. From there to Devlin Singe is day 9. Another full day of travel from Devlin Singe to Battergast. Battergast to Port Fenwick. Port Fenwick can either go to Rat's Wallow, or Dejari Isles, and that's pretty much your 12th day of travel. You've got a little bit more than 25 miles maybe, but if you push on and sort of force your march, you can get here on day 13 and then day 14 or so. So notice, we've got about a half a month if we wanted to just go one day at a time. That's not to say that all your gameplay needs to be encapsulated within 2 weeks, because there's nothing that says you can't go to Gromadia and spend 4 days here in Gromadia before you head out on the 11th, 12th, 13th day towards Devlin Singe. But the point is, by having everything so small like that and so close, or at least designing with that mentality, you can really start to put a lot of detail and a lot of content within such a small space, and it makes your world, when you expand that out, as I said, with sort of, box number 1, box 2, 3, 4. If these are each 100 miles, you're now covering this 400-mile space, and now what you're doing is you're filling your world with interesting things. If you're going to have 1,000 miles of Siberia and empty space, do you really need that 1,000 miles there? What's the significance of having... I know I didn't put anything over here on the right, but if you look at the size of this based on my scale, this is maybe only 150 miles by 100 miles across. That's it. That's not a massive region that I've kind of glossed over. But when you have a map that's the scale of 0 to 3,000 miles, you've got 1,000 miles of empty space. And that's okay initially, but from a designer creative point of view, what happens is I now have 1,000 miles that my mind needs to fill in to make that space worthwhile. Otherwise, why does it exist? Okay? So I think by kind of focusing in on the 400 miles, I've created these small little pockets of interest. And what I'm going to do real quickly is I'm going to just pull up all of these bullet points of where my mind was going with these things. I'm not going to elaborate on them, but I just want to show you how, by using the 5 bullet point system, you can really create interesting bits within such a small area. Okay, so let's start with Bine Rock. Bine Rock, when I wrote the name down, I kind of just thought, and I just worded these very, very quickly. I labeled them very, very quickly, and I purposely spaced them out, as said, about a day's travel away from each other. Okay, and the interesting thing here now is when you notice, and I go through all these bullet points, and when I sort of give the gist of what that area is, maybe the people that live there, the culture, what are the interesting things that your players would want to interact with, it's up to you to now figure out what would be the ramifications of being so close. But that's the beauty of the design and sort of this creative exercise, is being able to say, if Bine Rock is only a day away from Araskale, and Araskale is like this, and Bine Rock is like that, and Araskale is only a day away from the Goblin Warrens, which is barely more than a full day away from Gromadia, what's the significance of them being so close to each other, right? But that's for you to fill in those spaces. And you can, of course, expand the map and say that my scale is 1,000 miles, and now you'll notice that Dungeon of Deadhome to Bine Rock is more like 250 miles away. But by designing with this small 25-mile square, 1 day of travel, you can really create some cool content. So Bine Rock, what I thought of very quickly is that's where the dwarves are. Something about Bine Rock, there's an undead king. He's a dwarf, but he's undead. Goblin War. Bine Rock is at war with the goblins from the Goblin Warrens. You've got relic crafters. stereotypical dwarven stuff, right? But there's some sort of ancient artifact level items that are being made here in Bine Rock. And then you have a group of people that live in Bine Rock, group of dwarves known as the Firemongers. They're evocation specialists, but maybe they dabble in some sort of fire-based magic spells that are not seen elsewhere in the world. That's just the interesting things I came up with Bine Rock. And I think the important exercise here is when I go through all of these places and how quickly, I literally, I just started typing, I hit enter, and I didn't think too much about what this stuff means yet. I'll let you dabble into that if you want to. But the creative exercise and the strength of this here is by creating these bullet points and then realizing that this set of 5 bullet points for Bine Rock is only 25 miles away from the 5 interesting things here, which is only 25 miles away from the 5 interesting things here. You start to create content that can happen for your players by them simply just going one day across the road, one day across the mountains, one day across the forest. Okay? So that's Bine Rock. Next, we're going to look at the Dungeon of Deadhome. There's some sort of eternal curse there. The dungeon's always open. You can always go in. The Mists. There's a place inside the dungeon known as the Hall of Kings, and that's where you'll find the sword. The Goblin Warrens. I mentioned Bine Rock is at war with them, therefore, these goblins are at war with the dwarves. A significant figure there is Chief Ibagut. He's the leader of the goblins. They dabble in alchemy. Perhaps that's where the world's most advanced and best healing potions come from. They also ride on large, maybe they don't fly, they have wings, but think of Komodo dragons with wings. They don't fly yet because they're young, but the goblins here ride on dragons. And then I don't know what this means, but there's something associated with the Goblin Warrens known as the Coils. And once again, I'll kind of back up for a second. Let's take a look at these other ones, right? So if we look at alchemy and dragon riders and the coils and interact with the stuff that was in Bine Rock, which is an undead king and relic crafters and firemongers, now look how interesting these stories are as we weave them in one another based on the fact that they're so close in proximity. They're only 25 miles across. So now we have a relationship between one and the other, and we can start creating some consistent and interesting gameplay. Araskiel. This is where the killed on sight elves. They basically hate everyone. They live there. Unless you have something worthwhile to them, you're pretty much not going to get in the front door. The lords of Araskiel, however, are sick. There's something about the spell lock that's associated with Araskiel. Perhaps magic is confined to level 6 spells and higher are no longer able to be cast, and you need the Araskiel elves to unlock that. There's also some interesting mounts in this world. You know, maybe you can ride on rhinos or large beasts of burden. The trainers of those mounts reside within Araskiel, and secretly, even though they're not drow, they worship Lolth. Maybe there's a small cult or a sect of them that worships Lolth within Araskiel. But again, how interesting are these bullet points given the proximity of the other places? We have Haven's Rest. And as I said, I just simply typed this in. I typed in Haven's Rest. I made it bold. And then very quickly, to stay within the creative mode and not get analytical of what these things mean or whether they're accurate. That's very important from a creative exercise or a design 101 point of view, is don't worry about accuracy yet. We can piece this together later. Let's just create interest first. In Haven's Rest, that's where the Top Thief Guild resides. There's a really important NPC known as Harry the Fence. That's where people can kind of, your PCs can leave off some stuff that they don't want to keep on them. But there's a curse of were-rats throughout this village known as Haven's Rest along this port or along the shore, right? And most of the residents there, on a full moon or at night, they become were-rats. Something about hag children. Certain children are born hags to begin with. And maybe it all ties into Baba Yaga. And now we have sort of a big boss fight that might potentially happen there in Haven's Rest. But once again, I'll keep going back to that because that's the importance of this exercise. When you have a Baba Yaga here, she's only 75 miles away from basically everything here. That's significant when something of that power is only 3 days away from any one of those places. Next, we go into Doyle's, which is along the coast. That's known as Polymorph Village. There's people there, or creatures. You can talk to a badger there. You can talk to an owl there. And then you have a really high-level NPC, a wizard. Maybe he's the one that's polymorphed everyone in the village. His name is Doyle the Wise. That's why the place is named after him. What does backpack quest mean? I don't know. But perhaps there's some massive package that needs to be delivered there, or that the PCs are going to pick up there that will take them to different places. But because our scale is so small, it's now viable for them to go from Doyle's to Battergast, because that's really only like less than 100 miles away. They can get there. It makes the PCs feel like they can accomplish the task without all this mundane filler space. You have sunken ships off of Doyle's. And then you have Sahagan dealers. They're negotiating and bartering with Sahagan that are kind of pulling up ashore along Doyle's. Okay? Next, we have the Kraken Waste. The Swallow Islands, or it swallows the islands. The Kraken is eating the islands that's in this area, so they're starting to go away. There's not a lot of land left anymore. We have an ancient pirate captain named Robar. His lost ship is said to be somewhere within here. But notice, I just made that circle. Based on my scale, it's only a 25-mile circle. That means a lot when your PCs are level 1, 2, and 3, when they don't have water breathing, or they want to just deal with swimming or whatnot. Okay? The plane of water, there's supposed to be a portal to the plane of water somewhere in the Kraken Waste. And then you have, I was thinking of like mini orcs that are sitting on these buoys all scattered throughout the Kraken Waste. And they're aquatic and, amphibious. And then you have Bubble City Ruins. Think of, I think it was the Phantom Menace, right? Where the Gungans lived or whatever. You go underwater and it's entirely in ruins, like in Atlantis, a city. But there's a bubble so that you can breathe in there and actually explore it. And now I have Visk. That's where there's lizard folk pirates reside, okay? There's a group of lizard folk known as the Shield Wardens. They're the best crafters of poison. That's where some thieves, perhaps from Haven's Rest. Again, we've only got a 2-day travel. It's 2 days there, two days there, and 2 days back, and they can get there and negotiate with the lizards of Visk to get some poison. Old world currency is there because of the pirates. Old gold, almost like finding gold bullion. Is that right? Bars and stuff today. But they're sort of paralyzed because they fear the Kraken of the Kraken Waste. Once again, he's roaming only 25 miles outside of their little port city. Okay? Next we have Gramadia. There's ape-like clans that roam in this sort of desert region. They always roam, and there's a wandering giant that hangs out among them. I think of Game of Thrones where that giant was there. That's significant. This is where I was also inspired by just Mad Maxian type of thing, right? Like weird beasts of burden that have, all sorts of stuff on them. And I'm not saying, if you watch the latest Mad Max where they had the caravans with a rock concert on it, but just really crazy, almost like Warhammer 40K, Space Hulk looking stuff, where these ape-like clans just have beasts of burden just carrying tons of stuff and trinkets and gadgets and steampunk looking stuff. But then I was also thinking of Book of Eli with Denzel Washington running through a post-apocalyptic setting. Therefore, I want to have blind witches are sort of a thing in Gramadia. And then there's a thing called the Raven Slot. I don't know what that means, but it sounds cool. Next, we have Devlin Singe. Bones of the Red. Okay, this is a very Singe kind of reminded me of, this is a big scorched region where the fossilized remains of an ancient red dragon is there. Scorched earth. There were once demonic portals there because of the heat and the temperature, but now they're sealed. Earthquakes. And then within the chasms and the cracked earth land, or the cracked earthquake land, is groups of halflings that live in these hovels. Next you have Battergast. It's the city of the dead. It's led by a revenant lord. However, these guys are neutral aligned for whatever reason. And now they're dabbling in and creating new spell lists and new magic. But there's sort of a Viking son. There's some Goliath or some Viking, nomadic Northman from way up here somewhere, perhaps, that lives here among the undead, and he's being raised by them. Perhaps the Revenant Lord sent his undead forces out and went to war with them up here somewhere, and now they've captured and kidnapped him, but instead of killing him or making him a slave, they're teaching him their ways. So that brings a little bit of interest there. Port Fenwick, there's elven ships here. And you have something called the Dajari Expeditions, where they make expeditions out to this island, similar to as you would pay and have Sherpa take you out to Everest. But then, of course, there's treasure hunts that are being, expeditions for treasure hunts out to the Dajari Isles. Secretly, they dabble in necromancy here. But no one messes with Port Fenwick because the leader of the city is deity, almost god level. We're almost done here. Next we have Rat's Wallow. This might be a place where the PCs can lay low and hide. Maybe there's a water elemental that's in charge of the city, kind of behind the scenes. And then you have kind of up against the cliff walls of the coastline, a place called Siren's Cove, where sirens have quite a bit of influence. There's an ancient old religion that's been forgotten or banned from the world that's dabbled in, that's here. And then you have a real key NPC by the name of Daggle Hen that lives in Rat's Wallow. You have the Djari Isles, like I talked about. This is where you have chasm crawling, so there's just these chasms and ravines that you travel into, and that's where you do the expeditions. This is where you're going to get loot, all sorts of magic items and gold. But you also have these Giralon temples. I'm thinking of like the video game Uncharted and Indiana Jones and very, Tomb Raider, Lara Croft. But then to kind of ramp it up, besides the temples that are guarded by these Giralons and real powerful ancient gorillas, you've got these massive worms that kind of are responsible for creating the chasms. So that brings a really interesting place. You have Kraskafell right down here. This is abandoned entirely. It used to be a dwarven fortress, but along the cliffside where the fortress was is now it's just pure ruins. It's kind of like, think of the Mines of Moria, but as it's abandoned, where the Fellowship went in there and there's nothing left alive. But they delved too deep, so what's below the ruins of the dwarven fortress of Kraskafell? We know that something called the Skullhelm resides within. And the last one, we have the Jungles of Jewel. Snakes and spiders and very Australia outback where everything there basically kills you. You have mosquitoes the size of rocks. And I'm thinking of Skull Island from King Kong, right? Where everything is just larger than life and just massively dangerous and poisonous. So those are just bullet points I came up with really quickly. And the exercise was a little more of a free think, as I said. But I think the interesting bit here, kind of latching on to the 400 subs, thank you everyone, is showing that within a 400-mile place, and notice, this is all I've done. I haven't dabbled into content of what is on the other parts of the, east of this mountain range and this forest. But when you shrink your scale down to this size and you zoom in and all of these bullet points that we've already went over, think of the amount of gameplay that you can have within 2 weeks of travel. The amount of fun gameplay you can have by just journeying north for a day, for going 25 miles west and then further west out into these Kraken wastes, into the islands. There's just so much value and worth to these sort of exercises because, again, there's nothing that says I can't now just copy and paste this over 6, 7, 8, 10 times and create something that's 2,500 miles across. But I think that's just a cool free think exercise, and it was just something I wanted to create very quickly for all of you guys in sort of celebration for the 400 miles, and that's just where my mind went. And I've made this ruined sigil, which means it is a rune. It is time to end this all before the magic of the ritual takes hold of you. Thank you everyone for the 400 subs. I'll talk to you guys soon. See you later and take care.